The first thing I noticed wasn't Rusty himself, but his shadow moving wrong across the yard. 3 weeks he'd been gone. 3 weeks I'd been calling his name into empty scrubland, checking with neighbors 50 miles in every direction, even putting up those pathetic lost dog signs at the general store in town. Part of me had given up hope, started accepting the silence that comes with living alone on a cattle station where your closest companion is a red heeler who knows your moods better than you do. But there he was, standing by the water trough at dawn like he'd never left, coat matted with burrs and dust, ribs showing through his fur. What made my coffee mug freeze halfway to my lips wasn't his condition, that could be explained by 3 weeks in the bush. It was the way he held himself, rigid as a fence post, staring, not at me but past me, toward the eastern ridge, where the old Brennan mine cut a black scar into the hillside. "Rusty," I called, and his ears twitched, but he didn't turn, didn't wag, didn't do that whole body wiggle he'd perfected since he was a pup. Just kept staring at that damned mine with an intensity that made the hair on my neck prickle. When I approached, he backed away, not far, just enough to stay out of reach. First time in 5 years he'd ever done that. I'd worked this station for Jake Morrison long enough to know every ridge, every creek bed, every stand of mallee scrub for 30 miles in any direction. Remote didn't begin to describe it. We were a good 2 hours from the nearest neighbor, 4 from town, and the only visitors we usually got were supply trucks and the occasional government inspector, making sure we weren't overgrazing the lease. The isolation suited me fine. Had ever since I'd come out here after things went sideways in Perth, looking for the kind of quiet you can only find where the land stretches empty to every horizon. Growing up, I'd never been the kind of bloke who talked much about feelings or made grand plans for the future. After school finished, I'd drifted through a series of jobs in the city, warehouse work, construction, a brief stint as a security guard that ended badly when I caught my supervisor skimming from the till. Each job felt like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit, going through motions that didn't mean anything to anyone, least of all me. The breaking point came when my mate Dave wrapped his car around a tree on the Mitchell Freeway, 3 times over the limit, and arguing with his girlfriend on the phone. I'd been the passenger who should have taken his keys, should have called him a taxi, should have done any of a dozen things that might have prevented the whole mess. Instead, I'd been nursing my own problems at the bottom of a stubby, letting him storm out of the pub because it was easier than dealing with someone else's drama. Dave survived, barely. His girlfriend didn't. Standing in that hospital corridor, listening to the machines keeping my best mate alive while knowing I'd have to face Emma's parents at the funeral. Something crystallized in my mind. City life, with all its complications and half-truths, and people who said one thing while meaning another, I was done with it. I needed space to figure out who I was supposed to be, and I needed work that mattered in ways I could measure and understand. Jake's advertisement in the West Australian had been simple. Station hand wanted, remote property, accommodation provided, must be reliable. The pay was half what I'd been making in Perth, but the job came with something money couldn't buy: honest work in country, where your choices had clear consequences. Fix the fence properly, or lose cattle. Maintain the water systems or watch stock die. Show up every day ready to work, or find yourself stranded 200 kilometers from the nearest town, with no references and no prospects. The Brennan mine had been part of the landscape as long as anyone could remember, though nobody talked much about its history. What I'd pieced together over the years was simple enough. Copper mine from the 50s, played out by the 70s, abandoned when the last of the Brennan family moved to the coast. The shaft went down maybe 100 feet, before branching into a network of tunnels that followed the mineral veins through the ridge. State government had declared it unsafe for public access back in the 80s, but they'd never bothered to seal it properly, just put up some warning signs that had long since fallen down or been used for target practice. Local wisdom said to stay clear, not because of cave-ins or bad air, though those were real enough concerns. The stories went deeper than safety warnings. Stock would go missing near the mine and turn up dead, with no obvious cause. Fence lines that ran close to the entrance needed constant repair, like the posts were shifting in ground that couldn't make up its mind. Hunters reported strange echoes, sounds that seemed to come from directly underfoot, even when they were standing on solid rock. Most telling was how the animals reacted to the place. Cattle wouldn't graze within a quarter mile of the entrance. Wild pigs, which would root through just about anything, left the area alone. Even the crows seemed to give it a wide berth, which made Rusty's fixation all the more unsettling. He'd been a gift from Jake's daughter when I first took the job, 8 weeks old and small enough to fit in my shirt pocket. Red heeler through and through, intelligent, loyal, built for the hard country we worked. Over the years, he'd saved my hide more times than I could count, barking warnings when cattle were about to charge, finding lost calves in thick scrub, even leading me back to the homestead that time. I got turned around in a dust storm that reduced visibility to arm's length. The dust storm had been a baptism of fire, my second month on the job. I'd been checking boundary fences when the wall of red dirt appeared on the horizon, moving faster than seemed possible. Jake had warned me about dust storms during my first week. How they could turn day to night in minutes. How the static electricity would make your skin crawl and your hair stand on end. How easy it was to get disoriented and walk in circles until you collapsed from dehydration. I'd thought I was prepared. I wasn't. When that wall of dirt hit, the world disappeared. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face, couldn't tell up from down, couldn't hear anything over the howling wind and the static crackle that seemed to come from inside my skull. I tried to follow the fence line back toward the homestead, but within minutes I'd lost track of direction completely. The fence posts appeared and disappeared in the red murk like ghosts, and I couldn't tell if I was walking toward safety or deeper into the empty country. That's when Rusty proved what he was made of. He stayed with me when every instinct must have told him to find shelter, pressed against my legs so I could feel his presence, even when I couldn't see him. When I stumbled and fell, he barked until I got back up. When I tried to veer off course following phantom sounds that seemed to promise relief, he blocked my path and forced me back toward the fence line. For 3 hours we walked through that red nightmare, and for 3 hours that dog was my compass, my anchor, my reason for keeping moving when every muscle in my body wanted to give up. When the wind finally died and the dust began to settle, I found myself sitting against a fence post, less than half a mile from the homestead, Rusty leaning against me and panting hard, both of us coated in red dirt, but alive. That experience created a bond between us that went deeper than the usual relationship between a man and his dog. We'd faced something together that tested both of us, and we'd come through it by trusting each other completely. From that day forward, I never doubted Rusty's judgment about anything that mattered, and he never gave me reason to. Which was why seeing him that morning, standing by the water trough like a stranger wearing my dog's face, shook me so badly. But this Rusty, the one standing in my yard with mud caked between his toes and his eyes fixed on the eastern ridge, felt like someone I'd never met. The way he moved when I tried to approach, deliberate, almost mechanical, the complete absence of recognition when I called his name. And that stare, unwavering and intense, pointing toward the mine like a compass needle finding magnetic north. "Where have you been, boy?" I asked, crouching down to make myself less threatening. He took another step back, then did something that made my skin crawl. He sat. Not the casual drop I was used to, but a precise placement of his haunches that looked more like a soldier coming to attention. And he barked once, sharp, commanding, before turning and trotting toward the eastern boundary of the property. He stopped after 20 yards and looked back, and the message was clear as spoken words. "Follow me." Every instinct I'd developed over 5 years in this country told me to let him go, to finish my coffee, and start the day's work of checking water tanks and mending fence line. The mine had stood empty for 40 years without requiring my attention. If Rusty wanted to lead me on some fool's errand through dangerous ground, that was between him and whatever had gotten into his head during his 3-week absence. But he was my dog, the only living thing on this station that depended on me for anything beyond a paycheck. And something in his behavior, that mechanical precision, that unsettling intensity, suggested he wasn't acting on whim or instinct. He was trying to tell me something. I set down my coffee mug and reached for my hat. Whatever Rusty had found out there, whatever had changed him from the companion I knew into this focused stranger, I needed to understand it. The morning's work could wait. Some things were more important than schedules. The walk to the mine took us through country I knew like the lines on my palms, but seeing it through Rusty's eyes made familiar landmarks feel foreign. He didn't stop to investigate interesting scents or chase the occasional rabbit that broke cover, didn't even pause for water when we crossed Miller Creek. Just kept that steady trot toward the ridge, occasionally looking back to make sure I was following. The morning air carried the sharp scent of eucalyptus and the dusty smell of sun-baked earth. A light breeze stirred the scrub, making small sounds that seemed louder than they should in the emptiness. As we climbed toward the ridge, I found myself noticing details I usually took for granted: the way the shadows fell differently in areas where the soil had been disturbed, the subtle paths worn by generations of animals moving through the landscape, the particular quality of silence that comes with true isolation. It was the kind of morning that should have felt peaceful, routine. Instead, tension built with each step closer to the mine. Rusty's behavior was infecting my mood, making me hyper-aware of every sound and movement. Twice I caught myself scanning the horizon for signs of other people, though I couldn't have said why. The mine entrance appeared gradually as we climbed, first as a shadow that might have been a trick of light, then as an unmistakable break in the rock face. The opening was wider than I'd remembered, maybe 8 feet across, tall enough for a man to walk upright. The steel rails that had once carried ore cars out of the depths disappeared into darkness after just a few feet. Warning signs that had been posted decades ago lay scattered around the entrance, their paint faded to illegibility. What stopped me in my tracks weren't the familiar features of the abandoned mine, but the tire tracks pressed into the red dirt near the entrance. Fresh tracks, maybe a day old, from something with wide treads, a 4-wheel drive, probably a utility vehicle, and not just one. I counted at least 2 different tread patterns, suggesting multiple vehicles had been here recently. I knelt beside the clearest set of tracks, studying the tread pattern and the depth of the impressions. Heavy vehicle, loaded with equipment or supplies. The tracks led right up to the mine entrance, then circled back toward the access track that connected to the main ridge road. But there was something odd about the pattern, too much disturbance for a simple in-and-out visit, as if someone had spent considerable time maneuvering near the entrance. Rusty had stopped at the entrance and was looking back at me with what I could only describe as impatience. When I didn't immediately follow, he disappeared into the shadows. "Rusty," I called, but my voice seemed to die just inside the entrance, swallowed by the darkness. I pulled out my phone to use as a flashlight, though I knew the battery wouldn't last long. The screen's glow revealed more than I'd expected to see. Someone had been camping here. Not at the entrance. That would have been visible from the ridge road, but maybe 30 feet into the mine, where the main tunnel opened into what had probably been a staging area. A sleeping bag was rolled against one wall, along with several bottles of water and what looked like packets of dried food. A battery-powered lantern sat on a natural shelf in the rock, and beside it, tools that definitely didn't belong in an abandoned copper mine. I picked up the laptop computer, noting it was a recent model, expensive. The surveying equipment looked professional-grade: GPS units, core sampling tools, digital calipers for measuring rock specimens. Sample bags filled with rock chips were arranged in neat rows, each one labeled with coordinates and dates. The dates made my stomach tighten. Some were from the past week, others going back nearly a month. Someone had been systematically exploring this mine for weeks, taking samples, mapping passages, treating it like an active research site. The camp setup suggested they'd been spending considerable time underground, not just making quick visits. And the professional quality of the equipment indicated this wasn't amateur prospecting or treasure hunting. Fresh air moved through the tunnel, suggesting the mine system had multiple openings. That was both reassuring and concerning. If someone was living down here, they weren't depending on the main entrance for ventilation, which meant they'd explored deeper into the system than any sane person should go. From somewhere ahead in the darkness, Rusty barked again, not the sharp command he'd given at the homestead, but something more urgent, almost distressed. I gathered up one of the sample bags and examined the rock chips more closely in my phone's light. The specimens looked different from the reddish copper-bearing ore I would have expected from the Brennan mine. These samples had a different coloration, with flecks and veins that caught the light in ways that seemed familiar, but which I couldn't immediately identify. I followed the sound of Rusty's barking, using my phone's light to avoid the worst of the debris that littered the tunnel floor. The mine was in better condition than I'd expected. The timber supports looked solid, and the roof showed no obvious signs of recent collapse. Someone had been maintaining the passage, clearing away loose rock, and even laying down wooden planks over the muddier sections. The evidence of recent human activity was everywhere once I started looking for it. Tool marks on the walls where someone had chipped away samples. Modern rope anchored to timber supports, suggesting someone had been rappelling into deeper sections. Even battery-powered LED strips running along the ceiling, providing permanent lighting for frequent visitors. The tunnel sloped gently downward and curved to the right, following what I assumed was the original mineral vein. After maybe 50 yards, it opened into a larger chamber, where multiple passages branched off in different directions. My light caught the gleam of metal rails disappearing into each tunnel, and I realized this had been the main junction of the mine system, where ore cars would have been sorted and directed toward different extraction points. Rusty's barking was coming from the leftmost tunnel, more urgent now, mixed with whining that sounded almost human in its distress. I called his name again and heard an answer that made me freeze. "Help!" The voice was female, weak but clear. "Please, is someone there?" I moved toward the sound, my phone's light revealing another figure huddled against the tunnel wall about 20 feet ahead. Rusty was beside her, no longer the mechanical stranger from my yard but the anxious protective dog I knew, licking at her face and whining softly. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and clothes that had once been clean outdoor gear. Now everything was caked with mud and rock dust, and her left leg was stretched out at an angle that suggested injury. Her face was pale with exhaustion, but her eyes were alert and tracking my movement. "Thank God," she breathed as I approached. I was starting to think, how did you find me? "My dog," I said, kneeling beside her. "He's been missing for 3 weeks, came back this morning acting strange, led me straight here." I played the light over her more carefully, assessing her condition. The left leg was definitely injured. I could see swelling around the ankle, even through her boot. Her hands were scraped raw, and she had a nasty cut on her forehead that had bled freely before scabbing over. 3 weeks? She frowned. "That's impossible. I've only been down here for, what day is it?" "Thursday, March 15th. The color drained from her already pale face. "I came down here on Sunday the 5th. She closed her eyes and leaned back against the tunnel wall. 10 days. Jesus, no wonder I feel like hell. What happened, and who are you?" "Sarah Chen. I'm a geologist with Perth Mineral Resources. Was conducting some preliminary surveys in the area when I heard about this place from someone in town." She gestured weakly toward the darkness behind her. "Came down to take a few samples, check the old survey reports against current conditions. The entrance I used is about half a mile north of here, smaller opening, harder to find. I'd been working back through the system when there was a collapse. Nothing dramatic, just a section of ceiling that gave way, but it blocked my route out completely." "Why didn't you try the main entrance?" "I did. Spent the first 2 days trying to find my way through this maze, but the tunnels don't connect the way the old maps suggested. Every time I thought I was getting close, I'd hit another dead end or a passage too dangerous to navigate." She paused, studying my face in the phone's glow. "You said your dog was missing for 3 weeks. That means he's been down here longer than I have." The implications of that settled over me like cold water. If Rusty had been in the mine system for 3 weeks, surviving on what? And how had he found his way out when Sarah, with equipment and training, couldn't manage it in 10 days? "There's something else," Sarah continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I wasn't just taking random samples, I found something down here. Something that explains why there've been vehicles around the area, why someone's been asking questions in town about mineral rights for this section." She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small sample bag filled with rock chips that glittered even in my phone's weak light. "Gold?" I asked. "Gold," she confirmed. "Not just traces, I'm talking about a significant deposit, probably following the same geological formation as the original copper vein. The assay work would need to be done to confirm it, but based on what I've seen," she shook her head in amazement, "this could be worth millions." The pieces began falling into place as I stared at those glittering rock chips. "That explains the unmarked ute I've been seeing," I said. "Last 2 weeks, maybe 3 times. Always heading toward this section, but I never saw it leave by the main road." Sarah nodded grimly. "Someone's been watching. Perth Mineral Resources sent me out here to investigate some irregularities in recent land title searches. Someone's been making inquiries about mineral rights for this area, but they're not going through proper channels. We think they're trying to jump the claim." "Jump the claim?" "But this is Crown land, isn't it? Crown land with existing mining leases that have been dormant for decades. Under Australian mining law, if you can prove the original leaseholder has abandoned the site, and you file the proper applications with evidence of valuable deposits, you can acquire the rights. But here's the thing, whoever's doing this doesn't want to wait for the legal process. They want everyone who knows about the gold gone before they file. A chill that had nothing to do with the underground temperature ran down my spine. Gone how? Mining accidents happen all the time. Cave-ins, gas leaks, people just disappearing in old workings. She met my eyes. I think they've been waiting for me to die down here. Once I'm gone, they file their claim, say they discovered the body during their initial survey work. Clean and simple. The camp I'd found near the entrance suddenly made more sense. Someone had been monitoring the mine, waiting to see if Sarah would find her own way out, or simply disappear permanently. When she didn't emerge after several days, they'd probably assumed the problem would solve itself. How much gold are we really talking about? I asked. Sarah's voice grew stronger as she shifted into professional mode, the excitement of her discovery temporarily overriding her exhaustion. The ore samples I collected show gold content that's extraordinary for this region. And it's not just a pocket deposit. The geological indicators suggest a major lode system running through that entire section of the mine. Based on the mineral formations and the concentration levels I've documented, we could be looking at one of the richest finds in the state's history. She pulled out a waterproof notebook and flipped through pages covered with measurements, sketches and calculations. See these readings? The gold content in some samples is running 20 to 30 grams per ton. That's 20 times higher than what most commercial operations consider profitable. And the vein structure suggests the deposit extends well beyond what I've been able to explore. Rich enough to kill for, apparently. Rusty's ears perked up suddenly, and he moved away from us toward the tunnel opening we'd entered through. A low growl rumbled in his throat. "What is it, boy?" But even as I asked, I heard it, the distant sound of engines, multiple vehicles approaching the main entrance. "They're back," Sarah whispered. "They check every few days, probably to see if I've tried to signal for help from the entrance." I killed the phone light immediately, plunging us into absolute darkness. The engine sounds grew louder, then stopped. Doors slammed, and I could hear voices carrying down through the shaft, though I couldn't make out words. "Is there another way out of here?" I asked quietly. "I've explored most of the accessible tunnels. There are passages that go deeper, but some are flooded, others have bad air. I've been afraid to risk them in my condition." The voices were getting closer. Someone had entered the mine. "Come on," I said, helping Sarah to her feet. "We can't stay here." "Where are we going?" "Deeper. It's better than letting them find us." We moved carefully down the tunnel, Sarah leaning heavily on my arm. Rusty stayed close, his body tense with alertness. The beam of my phone light seemed impossibly bright after the complete darkness, so I kept it aimed at the ground and covered most of it with my fingers. Behind us the voices grew clearer as they echoed through the stone passages. 2 men, maybe 3. I could hear boots on rock, the clink of metal equipment. "She's got to be in here somewhere," one voice said. "Dog tracks at the entrance. Fresh boot prints." "About bloody time," another replied. "Been waiting 2 weeks for her to either find a way out or die. Should have just gone down and finished it days ago." Sarah's grip tightened on my arm. She'd heard it too. Confirmation that this wasn't an accident. They'd been deliberately leaving her trapped, waiting for her to die of dehydration or exposure, so they could claim her discovery as their own. "Can't risk it looking like murder," a third voice added. "Mining accidents cleaner. Body found during routine exploration. Tragic but not suspicious." The tunnel we were following began to slope downward more steeply, and I could smell moisture in the air. The walls felt different too, more natural stone than the timber-reinforced passages we'd left behind. "This section wasn't part of the original mine," Sarah whispered. "It's a natural cave system that the miners broke into. That's probably how your dog survived down here. There's water ahead." The sound of our pursuers faded as we descended, but I knew it was temporary. They had lights, they had time, and they knew Sarah was down here somewhere. Eventually they'd work up the courage to follow us deeper into the system. The passage opened into a larger cavern, and I could hear water flowing somewhere in the darkness ahead. I risked a slightly brighter light, and saw we were in a natural limestone chamber, maybe 30 feet across. On the far side, a dark opening led deeper into the rock. "I explored about 50 meters into that passage," Sarah said. "There's a stream running through it, maybe knee-deep in places, but I don't know where it goes, and with my ankle." Behind us, light began to bounce off the tunnel walls. They'd found our trail. "Doesn't matter," I said. "We can't fight them, and we can't hide. Moving is our only option." Sarah nodded, though I could see the fear in her eyes. We were trading the known danger of the men behind us for unknown hazards ahead. Rusty had already moved toward the water passage and was looking back at us expectantly. At least one of us was confident about the route. We splashed into the stream, and the cold water was a shock after hours in the dry tunnels. The current wasn't strong, but the rocks underfoot were slippery, and Sarah struggled to maintain her balance. I kept one arm around her waist and used the phone light to illuminate our path. The passage twisted and turned, sometimes widening into larger pools, other times narrowing until we had to duck to avoid the ceiling. The water varied in depth from ankle-deep to mid-thigh, and I tried not to think about what would happen if it got too deep for Sarah to manage. Behind us, echoing through the limestone, I heard shouting. They'd reached the cavern and discovered our route. They won't follow us far into water, Sarah said hopefully. Too risky without proper equipment. But even as she said it, we heard splashing behind us. These weren't casual claim jumpers. They were serious enough about eliminating witnesses to risk the underground stream. The passage ahead split into two channels. Rusty moved without hesitation toward the left fork, but I paused, shining my light down both routes. The right channel looked wider, easier to navigate, but Rusty was insistent about the left passage. Your dog seems to know where he's going, Sarah observed. He's never steered me wrong before. I hoped that streak would continue. The left passage was narrower, but the water was shallower. We made better time, though Sarah was breathing hard and I could feel her leaning more heavily on me with each step. Her injured ankle was getting worse, and the cold water wasn't helping with her overall condition. There, she gasped, pointing ahead. I followed her gaze and saw what she meant. Natural light, faint but unmistakable, filtering down from somewhere above. The passage was leading upward, and there was an opening to the surface somewhere ahead, but the voices behind us were getting closer too. In the confined space of the tunnel, sound carried clearly in both directions. I could hear two distinct voices, maybe three, and they were gaining ground. Sarah, I said quietly, how fast can you move? Not fast enough, she admitted. My ankle's getting worse, and I'm exhausted, if they catch up to us. She didn't need to finish. We both knew what would happen. The tunnel opened into another chamber, this one, with a pool of deeper water blocking most of the floor. The natural light was stronger here, coming from what looked like a vertical shaft in the ceiling, but the only way forward was through the pool, and I had no idea how deep it was. Rusty waded in without hesitation, and the water came up to his chest, maybe 4 feet deep. Manageable for me, but Sarah was shorter, and her injured ankle would make swimming difficult if she needed to. I can't, she said, looking at the dark water. I'm sorry, but I can't do it. Leave me the light and get out, get help. Like hell. I was already moving into the pool, pulling her with me. We've come this far together. The water was deeper than it looked, 5 feet in the middle, maybe more. Sarah went under briefly, and came up gasping, but I managed to keep her head above water as we struggled across. The cold was brutal, and I could feel both of us starting to lose coordination. Behind us, lights appeared in the tunnel mouth. They'd reached the chamber. There, in the water. A sharp crack echoed through the cavern, and something splashed into the pool near my head. They were shooting at us. Dive! I pushed Sarah under and followed, using the phone light underwater to navigate toward the far side of the pool. The light scattered strangely through the water, but I could see the bottom and the opposite edge where the passage continued. We surfaced on the far side, both of us gasping and shaking from cold and adrenaline. The passage here was barely 4 feet high, forcing us to crouch as we moved. But it was moving upward, and the natural light was definitely getting stronger. More gunshots echoed behind us, but the sound was muffled now. They'd have to cross the pool to follow us, and that would buy us time. Can you make it? I asked Sarah as we stumbled forward through the shallow water. Have to, she replied through chattering teeth. Rusty was already 20 meters ahead, and I could see him silhouetted against what looked like actual daylight. We were close to getting out. But behind us, the splashing sounds indicated our pursuers had entered the pool. They were still coming, and they were still determined to make sure neither Sarah nor I left these tunnels alive. The passage took one final upward turn, and suddenly we were looking at a narrow opening in the hillside, hidden behind a screen of scrub and fallen rocks. It was barely wide enough for a person, invisible, unless you knew exactly where to look. We squeezed through the opening and found ourselves on a steep hillside about 2 kilometers from the main mine entrance. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the scrubland, and I'd never been so happy to see open sky. But we weren't safe yet. The men behind us would be through the opening in minutes, and we were both exhausted, wet, and exposed on the hillside with nowhere to hide. Sarah collapsed against a boulder as soon as we were clear of the opening, her breathing ragged and her face pale. The bleeding from her leg wound had started again during our escape through the water, and I could see dark stains spreading through the makeshift bandage I'd applied earlier. "We need to move," I said, scanning the hillside. "They'll be through that opening any minute." She nodded but struggled to stand. Her injured leg buckled, and she had to grab my arm for support. "I don't think I can make it much further." The sound of voices echoed from the opening behind us. Our pursuers had reached the exit. I could hear them arguing about the best way through the narrow gap, buying us precious seconds. "There." I pointed toward a dry creek bed about 50 meters down the slope. "If we can reach that washout, we can follow it toward the main creek system. The banks will give us cover." Rusty had already started down the hillside, moving in the low, purposeful way he used when herding cattle through difficult terrain. He understood we needed to stay hidden. Sarah gritted her teeth and nodded. "Help me." I got her arm around my shoulders and half carried her down the slope, trying to keep us behind the larger rocks and scrub bushes. The loose soil made footing treacherous, and more than once we nearly fell as small avalanches of stone scattered away from our feet. "Behind us," I heard the first man squeeze through the opening, then voices conferring in low tones. "They're tracking us," one called out. "Fresh blood on the rocks here." We reached the dry creek bed just as a flashlight beam swept across the hillside above us. The washout was deeper than it had looked from above, nearly 6 feet in places, carved out by decades of flash floods. We pressed ourselves against the bank as the light passed overhead. "Can't see them," another voice said, "but they can't have gone far. The woman's injured." "Split up," came the reply. "You take the high ground, I'll follow this gully. They're probably trying to reach the main creek." Sarah was shivering violently now, whether from cold, blood loss, or shock, I couldn't tell. Probably all three. The wet clothes weren't helping, and I could see her strength fading with each passing minute. We moved along the creek bed as quietly as possible, following Rusty, who seemed to know instinctively which direction to take. The dog had spent years working this country with me, and he understood the lay of the land better than most people. After about 10 minutes of careful progress, we heard water, the sound of actual running water, not just the echo from underground passages. The dry creek bed we'd been following joined a larger watercourse, one of the seasonal streams that fed into Brennan Creek during the wet months. "This connects to the main creek system about 1 kilometer downstream," I whispered to Sarah. "If we can follow it down, we'll hit the road eventually." She nodded weakly, but I could see she was struggling. The adrenaline that had carried her through the underground escape was wearing off, and her injuries were taking their toll. A branch snapped somewhere behind us in the darkness. Our pursuers were still tracking us, still determined to finish what they'd started. We pressed on along the creek bank, using the sound of running water to mask our movement. Rusty stayed close now, occasionally looking back at Sarah with what I could only describe as concern. The dog had always been good at reading people, and he could tell she was in trouble. The creek wound through a series of low hills, and as we followed it downstream, I began to recognize landmarks. We were still several kilometers from the road, but at least I knew where we were. Sarah stumbled and nearly fell into the water. When I caught her, I could feel how much weight she was putting on me. She was weakening fast. "I need to rest," she whispered. "Just a little further. There's a place up ahead where the creek runs through a culvert under an old mining track. We can take shelter there." But even as I said it, I wondered if she'd make it that far. The blood loss, the cold, the stress, it was all adding up, and behind us, the voices of our pursuers seemed to be getting closer. The culvert appeared around the next bend, a concrete tube about 3 meters wide, where the old mining road crossed the creek. It wasn't much shelter, but the road itself was long abandoned, grown over with scrub, and it would hide us from casual observation. I helped Sarah into the culvert, and she immediately slumped against the concrete wall. In the dim light reflecting off the water, I could see how pale she'd become. "The bleeding's getting worse," she said quietly. I checked the bandage on her leg. She was right. The makeshift dressing was soaked through, and I could see fresh blood seeping around the edges. "We need to get you to a hospital. Those men, they're not going to give up. Even if we make it to the road, even if we get help, they know who I am. They know what I found down there." I was starting to understand what she meant. This wasn't just about eliminating witnesses to a claim-jumping operation. The gold deposits she discovered were worth millions, maybe tens of millions. That kind of money made people desperate, made them willing to do things they'd never normally consider. The sound of boots on gravel made us both freeze. Someone was walking along the old mining road above us, moving slowly, searching. Rusty pressed himself against my leg, every muscle tense but making no sound. The dog understood the danger as clearly as we did. A flashlight beam played across the mouth of the culvert, and I pulled Sarah deeper into the shadows. The beam lingered for a moment, then moved on. "See anything?" a voice called from further up the road. "Tracks by the creek, but they could be from cattle. Hard to tell in this light." "Keep looking, they can't have gone far." The footsteps moved away, but I knew they'd be back, and Sarah was getting weaker by the minute. I made a decision that went against every survival instinct I had. The situation was desperate, and desperate times called for calculated risks. "Stay here," I whispered to Sarah. "Keep pressure on that wound. Rusty will stay with you." "Where are you going?" "To even the odds." I'd spent my whole life in this country, working cattle, fixing fences, dealing with the 1,000 small emergencies that came with station life. I knew how to move quietly through scrub, how to read tracks, how to use the terrain to my advantage. These men might have guns and determination, but this was my home ground. I slipped out of the culvert and followed the creek bank upstream, moving parallel to the old mining road. I could see flashlight beams playing across the landscape as the two men searched, and I could hear their voices as they coordinated their hunt. The plan forming in my mind was simple and dangerous. Sarah wasn't going to survive much longer without medical attention, and as long as these men were hunting us, we'd never make it to safety. I needed to change the dynamic, shift from being hunted to being the one in control. Working cattle for years had taught me patience and the importance of reading your opponent. Angry bulls, spooked horses, rams protecting their territory. They all had patterns, predictable behaviors you could use against them if you were smart about it. These men were no different. They were confident, maybe overconfident, hunting what they assumed was injured prey that posed no real threat. I worked my way around behind the searchers, using every bit of cover the broken country provided. The moon was rising now, giving just enough light to navigate by, but also making concealment more difficult. The first man was working his way down a shallow gully about 100 meters from where I'd left Sarah. He was moving carelessly, making noise, obviously confident that he was hunting injured prey that posed no threat. His flashlight beam swept back and forth in a predictable pattern, and he was paying more attention to the ground than to his surroundings. I got within 10 meters of him before he sensed something was wrong. He started to turn, bringing his flashlight around, but I was already moving. 20 years of wrestling cattle had given me a good understanding of leverage and momentum. He went down hard, his flashlight spinning away into the scrub. The gun was the problem. I could see it in his hand, and even stunned, he was trying to bring it around toward me. We struggled in the dirt and broken rock, both of us fighting for control of the weapon. A gunshot echoed across the hills, not from our struggle, but from somewhere downstream. The other man, shooting at shadows, or maybe at Sarah and Rusty. The thought gave me the strength I needed to wrench the pistol away from my opponent. "Stay down," I told him, backing away with his gun, but he was already reaching for something else, a radio or cell phone. I couldn't let him call for backup or alert others about what was happening here. The next few minutes blurred together in a confusion of action and adrenaline. When it was over, the first man was secured with his own zip tie restraints. Apparently these guys had come prepared to deal with prisoners. His weapon was safely out of reach, and his radio was destroyed, but the gunshot from downstream had me worried. I needed to find the second man before he found Sarah. Moving more carefully now, I worked my way along the creek toward the sound of that gunshot. The second searcher was more cautious than his partner, staying in cover and moving with deliberate precision. He'd heard the sounds of our struggle and knew something had gone wrong. I found him crouched behind a fallen log about 50 meters upstream from the culvert, watching the approaches with his weapon ready. He was positioned well, with good visibility and multiple escape routes, but he was focused on the creek and the road, not expecting an approach from behind. The key was patience. He was alert now, aware that he might be facing more than just an injured geologist and a station hand, but alertness was tiring, and he couldn't maintain that level of vigilance indefinitely. I waited, watching him scan the landscape, noting the rhythm of his movements, the pattern of his attention. After about 10 minutes, he began to relax slightly, convinced that the immediate threat had passed. That's when I moved. The approach had to be perfect. One mistake, and he'd have a clear shot at me, and probably at Sarah as well. I used every trick I'd learned in years of moving through this country, placing each step carefully, avoiding loose rocks and dry branches, staying below his line of sight. The final approach was the most dangerous. 5 meters of open ground with no cover, relying entirely on timing and his momentary inattention. He never saw me coming. By the time I worked my way back to the culvert, dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern sky. Sarah was unconscious when I found her, Rusty standing guard with his hackles raised. The dog relaxed when he saw me, but I could see the worry in his eyes. I checked Sarah's pulse, weak but steady, then activated the satellite phone I'd taken from the second man. The emergency services operator who answered seemed skeptical at first, but the GPS coordinates from the phone and my description of Sarah's injuries got an ambulance dispatched to the nearest road access point. Then I called the police. The next hour was a blur of activity. Paramedics arrived first, stabilizing Sarah and getting her ready for transport. The police came shortly after, along with what seemed like half the emergency services in the district. Initially there was skepticism about our story. 2 men tied up with tales of underground gold deposits and attempted murder. It sounded like something out of a movie. But the evidence was all there. The mining equipment in Sarah's camp, the fresh excavations in the sealed mine, the weapons our attackers had been carrying, the detailed geological surveys documenting the gold deposits. And when they brought the 2 men in for questioning, their story fell apart quickly. Faced with charges of attempted murder, kidnapping and conspiracy to defraud, they started talking, trying to cut deals. It turned out they were part of a larger operation, using inside information from mining surveys to identify valuable deposits on remote properties, then using whatever means necessary to gain control of the land or the mineral rights. Morrison and Kellerman, that's what their names were. Morrison had connections in the Perth mining industry, access to geological surveys and government databases. Kellerman was muscle, hired help, with a history of standover tactics and intimidation. Sarah had stumbled into their operation by accident when Perth Mineral Resources sent her to investigate the irregular land title searches. Once they realized what she'd discovered in the mine, they couldn't afford to let her live to report it. The plan had been elegant in its simplicity. Wait for Sarah to die of exposure or dehydration in the mine, then discover her body during their own survey work. File the mineral rights claims as the discoverers of both the deposit and the tragic accident. Clean, simple, and perfectly legal. 3 weeks later, I was sitting on the veranda of the homestead, watching Rusty work a mob of cattle in the far paddock. The dog had settled back into his normal routine quickly, but I noticed he still avoided going near the Brennan mine area. Sarah had recovered well. The surgery to repair the damage to her leg had been successful, and the doctor said she'd make a full recovery. She'd called a few days earlier to tell me that her official report on the gold deposits had been filed, and that a major mining company was already in negotiations with the property owners. Looks like everyone's going to do well out of this, she'd said. Including you. There's a substantial finder's fee for reporting significant mineral discoveries. But that wasn't really what mattered. What mattered was that we'd both survived, that justice had been done, and that I'd learned something about myself I hadn't known before. When the crisis came, when someone needed help, I'd been able to do what was necessary, not because I was particularly brave or heroic, but because it was simply the right thing to do. The Brennan mine had been permanently sealed now, the entrance filled with concrete and marked with warning signs. The gold would stay in the ground until proper extraction methods could be developed, with all the environmental studies and regulatory approvals that major mining operations required. Rusty came trotting back toward the house as the sun set behind the hills, his work done for the day. He settled beside my chair with a contented sigh, and I scratched behind his ears. Good dog, I told him. Good dog. He'd been the real hero in all this, leading me to Sarah when she needed help, guiding us through the darkness when we needed escape. Dogs understood loyalty in a way that humans sometimes forgot. Simple, absolute, unwavering commitment to doing right by those who mattered. Maybe that was the real lesson in all of this. Not the dramatic confrontations or narrow escapes, but the quiet understanding that when someone needs help, you help them. When someone's in danger, you don't walk away, you do what needs to be done, whatever the cost. The country had always taught hard lessons, but this had been different. This had been about more than just survival. It had been about what kind of person you choose to be when everything's on the line. A month later, the letter arrived. Hand-delivered by a courier from Perth, official-looking envelope with Perth Mineral Resources letterhead. Inside was a check that made me blink twice to make sure I was reading the numbers correctly, along with a letter from Sarah. "Dear Jack," it began. "The finder's fee came through faster than expected. The mining company's geological survey confirmed everything we suspected and more. They're estimating the deposit could be worth upward of $50 million once extraction begins in 5 years. Your share is enclosed. Don't argue, you earned every cent of it." I set the check on the kitchen table and kept reading. She wrote about her recovery, how the physiotherapy was going well, how she'd been cleared to return to fieldwork but was taking a desk job for a while. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened down there," the letter continued. "Not just the fear or the danger, but what you did. You didn't hesitate. You didn't ask what was in it for you. You just helped, because someone needed helping. In my line of work, I meet a lot of people who'd have walked away, or worse, tried to cut a deal with men like Morrison and Kellerman. The fact that you didn't says something important about who you are." Rusty padded into the kitchen and settled at my feet, watching me read. He'd grown grayer around the muzzle these past months, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. Sometimes I caught him staring toward the hills where the Brennan mine lay buried under tons of concrete, as if he could still sense something out there that needed watching. "I wanted you to know," Sarah's letter went on, "that Morrison and Kellerman were sentenced last week. Morrison got 15 years for attempted murder, assault, and conspiracy to defraud. Kellerman took a plea deal, 8 years. Their lawyer tried to argue they were just prospectors who panicked, but the evidence was pretty clear about their intentions. The stolen equipment, the forged documents they'd prepared to file fraudulent claims, the weapons. The prosecutor said it was one of the more straightforward cases he'd seen." I folded the letter and looked out the window toward the paddock where the cattle were grazing peacefully. It was hard to believe that just a few months ago, I'd been crawling through flooded mine shafts, listening to the echo of gunshots in the darkness. The whole experience felt like something that had happened to someone else, except for the dreams that still woke me some nights. Dreams of black water and the sound of Sarah's labored breathing in the tunnels. The check represented more money than I'd seen in 5 years of station work. Enough to buy my own place, maybe start a small operation. The thought should have excited me, but instead I found myself thinking about what I'd learned down in those tunnels. Money was useful, security was important, but what really mattered was the quiet knowledge that when the moment came, you could do what needed doing. A week later, old Bill Murphy stopped by the homestead with news from town. I was mending fence in the home paddock when his ute pulled up, dust cloud trailing behind it like a banner. "Heard you came into some money," he said without preamble, climbing out and adjusting his hat against the sun. News traveled fast in country towns. I'd deposited the check 3 days earlier and hadn't told anyone about it, but somehow Bill knew. He probably knew what I'd had for breakfast too. I admitted, setting down the wire cutters. "Good for you, son. That business at the mine." He shook his head. "Still can't believe it happened right here. Men, like that, coming into our country, thinking they can just take what they want." We walked along the fence line together, Rusty trotting ahead of us. Bill had been working this land for 40 years, had seen droughts and floods, good seasons and bad ones. His opinion carried weight. "Question is," he continued, "what you planning to do with it?" It was a fair question. I'd been asking myself the same thing for days. The money could change everything. Give me independence, security, choices I'd never had before. But I kept thinking about Sarah's letter, about what she'd said about character being revealed in crisis. "Been thinking about that," I said. "Got any ideas?" Bill stopped and looked at me seriously. "Matter of fact, I do. The Hendersons are selling up. Medical bills got too much for them after Jim's stroke. Good property, reliable water, decent house. They're asking fair price, but they need to sell quick." I knew the Henderson place. 2,000 acres of good grazing land, adjoining the station where I worked. It would make a solid foundation for a small operation. More than that, though, Bill continued. They're worried about what happens to their stock. Got some good breeding cattle they can't take with them, don't want to see them go to the abattoirs. You could do worse than starting with proven bloodlines. That evening I sat on the veranda with Rusty at my feet, watching the sun set behind the hills. The Henderson place sat in that direction, its lights just visible across the valley. I'd driven past it hundreds of times over the years, admired the neat fences and well-maintained buildings, never imagining I might one day own something like it. The money made it possible, but the real decision went deeper than that. Staying in this country, putting down roots, meant accepting responsibility, not just for the land and the stock, but for being the kind of neighbor people could count on. It meant becoming part of something larger than myself. 2 weeks later, I drove into town to meet with the bank manager. The loan paperwork was straightforward. Sarah's finder's fee made for a substantial down payment, and my employment record with the station provided the rest of the security the bank needed. By afternoon I was shaking hands with Jim Henderson on the deal. Glad it's going to someone who understands the country, he said, his grip still firm despite the stroke that had slowed his speech. This land's been good to us for 30 years, hope it'll be good to you too. His wife Mary pressed a manila folder into my hands as we prepared to leave. Records on all the cattle, she explained, breeding history, vaccination schedules, everything you'll need. And Jack? She paused, looking suddenly emotional. That business at the mine, what you did for that girl, it means something, knowing there are still people like you around. Moving from the station quarters to my own place took less time than I'd expected. 27 years old and everything I owned fit in the back of my ute. But the real transition was deeper than just changing addresses. For the first time in my life I was responsible for something that was entirely mine. The work was familiar but different. Checking stock, maintaining fences, managing water sources. I'd done it all before, but always as someone else's employee. Now every decision mattered in a way that felt both liberating and sobering. When a section of fence came down in a winter storm, fixing it was my responsibility. When the cattle needed moving to fresh pasture, the timing was my call. Rusty adapted to the change better than I did. He'd always been a working dog, but now he threw himself into the job with renewed purpose, as if he understood that this was our place, our stock to care for. He learned the boundaries of the property within days and appointed himself guardian of everything within them. The first night in my own house felt strange. No Jake Morrison to report to in the morning, no predetermined schedule of tasks handed down from someone else. Just me and Rusty and 2,000 acres of country that were ours to manage. I walked the boundary lines that first week, reacquainting myself with every creek crossing, every gate, every section of fence. The Hendersons had maintained the place well, but there were small jobs everywhere, a loose wire here, a blocked culvert there, the kind of ongoing maintenance that kept a station running smoothly. Spring brought new challenges and new satisfactions. The first calves born on my land felt like a personal victory. I found myself checking on them multiple times a day, making sure the mothers were healthy, that the young ones were thriving. The Hendersons had built a solid foundation with their breeding program, and I was determined not to let it deteriorate under my management. The rhythm of station life suited me. Up before dawn to check water troughs and count stock. Days spent moving cattle, repairing fences, maintaining machinery. Evenings on the veranda with Rusty, planning the next day's work, and watching the sun set over land that was genuinely mine. Sarah visited in October, driving up from Perth in a new Toyota with survey equipment in the back. Her limp was barely noticeable now, and she'd regained the confident bearing I remembered from our first meeting in the mine. We walked the boundary between my property and the sealed mine entrance, Rusty staying close but no longer showing the anxiety he'd displayed in the months immediately after the incident. "Looks like you've found your calling," she said, watching me check a water trough that had been running low. "The place looks better than when the Hendersons had it." "Still learning," I admitted, "making plenty of mistakes. That's how you get good at something." She paused, studying the concrete cap that now permanently sealed the mine entrance. "I heard from the mining company last week. They're putting together a proposal for the landowners, but extraction won't begin for at least 5 years. Environmental studies, infrastructure development, regulatory approval. It's a long process." "Good," I said, and meant it. This country's been here a long time, the gold can wait a bit longer. As evening approached, we sat on the veranda of what was now my house, sharing a beer and watching the cattle settle for the night. The conversation turned to the men who'd tried to kill us both, their recent conviction, the justice that had finally been served. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Rusty hadn't found you that day," Sarah mused. "If you'd just assumed I was another casualty of an old mine." I scratched behind Rusty's ears, feeling the familiar texture of his coat, the solid warmth of his presence. "He wouldn't have let that happen. He knew you needed help." "Dogs see things differently than we do," she agreed. "Simpler, maybe. Right and wrong, help or abandon, loyalty or betrayal. Not much middle ground." After she left the next morning, I found myself thinking about that observation. The events at the mine had seemed complicated at the time, questions about risk and reward, about getting involved in someone else's troubles. But Rusty had seen it clearly from the beginning. Someone needed help, so you helped them. The rest was just details. The first year on my own place ended with a modest profit, and a growing sense that I'd found where I belonged. The second year brought a drought that tested everything I'd learned about water management and stock rotation. I spent weeks moving cattle between paddocks, searching for feed, supplementing with expensive hay trucked in from areas that had received better rain. It was during that drought that I truly understood what the Hendersons had built. The property's water system was designed for dry years, bores positioned strategically, tanks sized to carry stock through extended periods without rain, paddocks planned so cattle could be rotated to preserve the most vulnerable areas. Every decision the previous owners had made over 30 years of management proved its worth during those hard months. The breeding program they'd developed produced cattle that could thrive on poor feed. The infrastructure they'd invested in kept operations running when neighbors were forced to sell stock or abandon marginal country. By the time the rains finally came in autumn, I'd gained a deep appreciation for the knowledge and dedication that had created the property I'd inherited. I'd also proven to myself that I could handle the worst this country could throw at a station owner. The third year saw good rains and strong calf prices that put the operation on truly solid footing. I was able to expand the herd, invest in better bulls, even purchase a small adjoining block when it came on the market. What had started as a favor to the Hendersons, taking over their life's work so it wouldn't be broken up or abandoned, had become something I couldn't imagine living without. Through it all, Rusty remained my constant companion and most reliable employee. He aged gracefully, his black coat now heavily peppered with gray, but his instincts remained sharp. He could read the weather better than any forecast, could spot a lame animal from half a mile away, could find lost cattle in country that would confuse a GPS. More than that, he seemed to understand the deeper significance of what we'd accomplished. This wasn't just another job, another place to work, until something better came along. This was home, in the truest sense of the word, a place where our efforts mattered, where our presence made a difference, where we belonged. On quiet evenings, sitting,